Nation in Conversation, in proud partnership with Senves, Bayer, Engen, Nedbank, AFGRI, Grain SA and John Deere, in association with Hinterland and Isuzu.
Welcome to Nation in Conversation from the Nampu Harvest Day. Today we are talking about probably one of the most important enablers of life. And it's not for water, life is not, there is no life. So I am going to ask each of the panelists to give us the introduction, who they are, a bit about their background and where they fit into in terms of this, the debate around water. But firstly, Francois, water from a producer point of view. Without water, nothing is possible.
Now maybe, Theo, if we start from the premises that we all understand the subject matter, I think we start at the wrong place. So let's not accept that everybody understands water in the same way. In fact, I think we understand water completely different from where you come from. And maybe a way to emphasize my point is, I think a lot of us has that understanding that if I buy a piece of land, I buy 1,000 hectares, I own everything. From the surface right down sort of the middle of the earth and up to the stratosphere. I own that 1,000 hectares. And obviously, if you think through it, you can't. You buy, as an agriculturalist or a farmer, you buy the surface. Minerals, water aquifers, rivers that run through it, obviously isn't the understanding that you buy it. And therefore we have to think differently about it. And I think that maybe is one of the principles why, we got where we are with water. I think that our next big crisis, and South Africans sort of stumble from one crisis to the other. We used to it in the last, especially since 2009 till about a year ago, maybe still some of those crises is carrying on. That's the way we opted and we operated. I think this is the next big crisis, which is already sort of developed into something much bigger than we can handle with a rand value.
Mike Sutcliffe, you have a distinguished career in, amongst other things, management of water infrastructure. Your view?
Well, I think that when we deal with the water situation, we've got to deal with it firstly holistically. It's terrible what you see in some parts of our country where you would have sanitation systems that are in trouble or whatever. But the big picture is that over the next 12 years, we are going to be in deficit of the order of about 3,500 million cubic meters of water per year. That's the reality. Secondly, in terms of climate change, we already know that parts of our country will get wetter. Many parts are already in drought, but that's not just climate change, but they're going to be in a worse situation there. The reality in South Africa is that you've got to deal with two challenges. The first challenge is where the people of our country live. 80% of our people live on 2% of the land. But equally, only 9% of our land area is the area where you either have an above ground or an underground source of water.
Only 9%?
Only 9% of the surface area of our country. So the reality is that we've got to begin to manage both of those. And I certainly agree with Francois, is that unless you adopt what our Constitution says we should do and treat waters as a human right, and it's a right to make sure that every person has equal access, because at the moment only about 40% of the people of South Africa have access to water in their homes. And many of that 40%, in fact, are not consuming much water. About 30% of South Africans consume way above the international average of what you expect households to consume. So until we get those who have a lot to understand that they're consuming too much water, and secondly, we're giving access to people who don't have it today, we're in trouble. And then there are a lot of other challenges that we need to do. At the moment, we work with two cabinet committees. One is dealing with the big picture on how we bring together about 35,000 projects, capital projects on infrastructure, water, electricity, sanitation, sewerage, etc. and how do we make sure that we align them properly? We've got something like 18 dams that we've recently built, but the communities that surround them don't have access to water yet because the reticulation plans are more complex. So communities then get into revolt because rich people who fish on those dams have an international competition and the community is waiting to get their water there. So how do we manage our way through that? And I agree with Francois, it is the big challenge. I think the recent elections saw that. I think that more ministers who are not water and sanitation ministers were called to communities that had sewage running in their streets to address that, of where businesses are putting all sorts of chemicals into the environment, etc. So it is our big challenge.
Benoit Leroy, perhaps just give us a bit of an idea of your background and then where do you fit into the water debate?
Okay, so I'm with a non-profit company called Water Shortage South Africa, and our principal aim is to mitigate the water shortages in our country. And I've been in the water business now for nearly 40 years. And we've got three types of water really in our country. And firstly, it's a nationalised resource, as are minerals. And everybody's focusing on the small and the medium water. The small water is to live, 25 litres per person per day. Maybe it should be 50. The medium water is really the 235 litres per day in a household. The real issue is the big water, the embedded water, and that's anywhere between 4,000 and 8,000 litres per person per day that we consume in a middle-class environment. And from an agricultural perspective, that consumes 60-odd%, where the global norm is, say, 70% of the traditional water resource, is our food security is at risk from a volumetric perspective. But we also have a qualitative issue where, for example, in Fuleni disaster, we have 125 million litres a day of sewage, untreated sewage going into our watercourse. It's, we have a smaller pie of water. We're actually polluting our resource. We have a catastrophe second to none compared to the Eskom energy crisis that we have. But food, water, and energy, there's a nexus. They're intertwined. And I think the fourth industrial revolution is telling us we need to look at these things in an integrated manner. And most global governments are not good at this yet. In South Africa, we really don't have time. 98% of our water was allocated already 3-4 years ago. Our ecological reserve has been encroached upon. So we're sitting on, I don't want to be alarmist, because we must never let a good crisis go to waste, but we have quite a, and we're innovative when we're forced to be and when we're in the corner, but we have a real challenge, and as South Africans, we're very good. We were amongst the first in the world to do interbasin transfers because our water is in the wrong places, for example. But our surface waters are finished. Our country's been drying out since 1982. And it's progressively drying out, especially in the winter rainfall seasons, because over and above the droughts. So water is a fundamental economic enabler, and we're tending to focus, there's a lot of focus on the small, medium water, but we're really focusing on the big water, because without food we can do very little. And also without water security and resilience, we can't attract investment, be it foreign or local. So our aim is not to take part in this, is really to be a catalyst to enable the mitigation of our water shortages. And we believe that we're sitting on a time bomb and we have enough time and ingenuity to actually sort it out.
Fred Platt, a bit of background and where do you fit into?
I'm the CEO of a listed company called Accentuate Limited. We have an interest in water, but I think more significantly, I've been involved in the call for a national strategy and a national focus on water. And I think there's a number of key principles that really drives that thinking and elevating water, or the water debate, right to the highest level. And I think the most wonderful thing is sitting here today and debating water, because that's what's required. A couple of important things. I think the first thing to understand, and it's historical, is that water is the ultimate economic enabler. So people establish communities around water. And all development has its root in water. Historically, we know that if there's except for Johannesburg, which had a different development path, but all other cities really established around water. The second thing is that we have this view about water, that water is, and in the words of Professor Anthony Turton, that water is a stock. We take it, we use it, and we dispose of it. And that is fundamentally where some of our problem in understanding water comes, because all we do is we move water from one form to another. And when we understand that, we can start unpacking the circular economy and understanding the impact of that. The next, and I think most critical debate here today, is that we know that in almost a zero growth economy, all of our water has been allocated. We also know that food production and food security is central to where we're going as a country and as globally. And the anticipation is that food production needs to grow by 70% by 2050. That would require an enormous access to water. But as urbanization, industrialization, hopefully some economic growth in our economy comes, the contestation for water is going to become a major issue. So agriculture, who currently is the largest user of water, will be the first target as far as that is concerned. Throw into that the complexity of land reform, and throw into that the need to develop emerging farmers, and we've got a debate. And that's really where we are.
Mike, your background is probably one of the more successful metro big city management roles in the country for a period of time. How did you approach this issue about water? We've now heard that there's a major issue in terms of utilization of water, but there's also an issue in terms of simply how are we going to get water to enough people. How did you manage that?
Well, the first thing we did was that we said, let's read our Constitution. I mean, we were involved in building it, but unless you look at what the Constitution says we should be doing, you're going to waste your time. And so we moved very quickly in a period of about 12 years from a situation where 1/3 of people who lived in the area, which is now called eThekwini, we moved from that to about 97% of the people in that city now have access to water. We did that through a number of mechanisms. One of those was making sure that we deal with high pressure systems and low pressure systems. So people living in more rural contexts, make sure we get water to them, but it's going to be not at the high pressure system that you would get, because the bulks are simply too expensive to expect everyone everywhere is going to get access there. Secondly, we moved, and we haven't moved fast enough, then we moved reasonably fast in bringing in grey water. So starting to get business in particular to understand that you don't need to be using this great water that we have in South Africa is in the top 10 of the world in terms of the quality of that water, the drinking water. You don't need to use that for every industrial use. The third area is to deal with this pressure issue. So as we had to, because what happened under apartheid, the irony was that many of the richer northern suburbs, as you'd say in Johannesburg terms, but in that case it was the western suburbs of eThekwini, they spent all of their money on beautifying their suburbs and not on dealing with the pipes there. So we needed to replace their pipes. Obviously, to do that effectively, you've got to reduce water pressure. Otherwise, you're just going to have, as you're replacing pipes, everything exploding. Because dealing with non-revenue water is critical. We're sitting at about 40% of the water that we do purify, that we buy from the bulk systems, and it should be probably about 18-20%, I would think, would be reasonable, evaporation and other things there. So try to deal with that complex of issues that you have there. But it doesn't mean to say they've all gone. And this is, I was using an example earlier when we were chatting, where over the weekend, one of the plants that we put in the Point area to deal with all of the major suburbs close to the inner city, basically has ended up with its 5 pumps out of action. Now that's almost a brand new facility. And when I spoke to the city manager a few days ago, part of the problem there is just the procurement systems, because if you're doing procurement properly, it might take you 6 to 8 months. You can't simply say, we need a new pump, let's go and buy this one. Equally, their raking systems had difficulties with them. So it's also a management problem, and I think that we've got to reflect on that as well. The competency levels that we've had at times haven't kept pace with what they should, because as the system expands to accommodate more people, you have fewer professionals. And it's not a South African problem only. I mean, throughout the world, quality water engineers, for example, are few and far between. I think that, big cities, New York City, etc., are faced with very similar changes. Those are the kind of things that you have to do, but you have to deal with it as that complex and looking towards the future, because certainly in our case, dealing with the issue of climate change means you're thinking of where the city will be in 50 or 60 years' time. And the only thing I told managers, think about the city when you're dead, what it would be like when you're dead. And that's what you should do today.
So you need to take a long-term view on it.
Absolutely.
The question, and perhaps, Benoit, you can assist with the question, in terms of part of the water problem is the infrastructure, that we lose quite a bit of the water in the infrastructure. Where does that fit in?
And I'll add on to what Mike is saying. So it's a global problem. And there is best practice, and Tokyo is below 2.5% unaccounted for water, non-revenue water.
2.5%. And where are we?
We're at 41.
40, yeah.
The leagues are probably 35. The problem is we don't know. Okay, these are big numbers.
Is that in line with your...
No, it is, but I kept fighting with Cape Town because they used to give fudged figures. So when I was in the city, so it's
So
very
Cape Town's
true.
also in line with this?
Oh no, Cape Town's worse.
Yes.
Well, it was then. I mean, I'm not dealing with current figures, but it is at least 41%, let's say it that way.
And I just want to just explain what you mean by unaccounted water.
So when you do, and everybody's using the same methodology for the mass balance, and it's International Water Association template, and it's the bulk water that you buy, you know. And in South Africa, we buy it normally from one bulk water. So eThekwini would be Umgani, for example. Here it's, not here, sorry, in Gauteng, it's Rand water mostly.
Is it here Rand water as well?
You have Rand water also, okay. So we have a big utility, provides you with 100 units, and I'm billing at the end of the day for 50 units. Unaccounted for water is 50 units, it's 50%. South African average is, we think it's 41%, okay, and I think that number is probably plus minus 5%. But the issue is it's very high. The global norm is 25% in cities. Okay, so our rural areas is a lot higher, and our smaller cities, so the B and C class municipalities, I think, is a lot higher. Johannesburg is around 40%, Pretoria also, etc. But it's far too high. It took Japan to go from 35 to 25, something like 10 years, another 15 years to get down to 5%. It's a global issue because...
Does that water disappear somewhere?
It leaks.
Or where does it...
It leaks mostly, well, you have some
South
theft.
Africa also gets stolen.
You get water theft.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's say of the 50% that disappears, that's not accounted for, let's say 10%, a quarter of that is stolen.
But the rest
The
disappears?
rest is leaking, and it's because of the pressure of the system. Now, most of our infrastructure in the world was built after the Second World War, and had a life of 40 years, if you maintain it properly. 40 years gone. And that's where the issue is. We need to go and So you're supposed to spend, you will know better than me, 5 to 8% of your infrastructure every year in a municipality, so that we didn't do that. So let me put another number on, not the 41%. We need R1 trillion to recapitalise to get water resilience in South Africa. That's twice the debt of Eskom. Let's make that a national priority. That is the number we need to focus on. The unaccounted for water, etc., we can manage that, and it's going to take a decade to a decade and a half to get it down from 40 to 20%. If you're at 25%, we're doing well.
Let me just, Fred, I'm going to come to you. I just want to, so you've got the wholesale supplier, and let's say it's Rand Water. I was always, for years, the CEO of Rand Water surname was Mr. Bath. I always think that was something.
You go to
Vincent
your,
Bath was the head of Rand Water.
There's a Mr. Vorster in Cape Town also.
Mr.
Vorster.
Yeah, it was just for me. It was strange, but if I unpack that, so you have the wholesale water distributor.
Yes.
In the case where we are now,
Yep.
it's Rand Water. Is the problem with a wholesale distributor, retail, or is it the whole chain?
It's
in
a
the
chain.
distribution.
It's a chain.
Because I think that now increasingly, and I think the last 5 to 10 years, I think everyone now talks of the value chain of water and sanitation. Because once you start looking at that, you start realizing that actually there are huge economic opportunities to do that properly as well. So you don't just look at it as it's bulk water and it's your reticulator on the other end. Yep.
I'll get to the solutions. Fred, you wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I think the important thing with regards to that is, obviously there's also issues around payment and non-payment of services that impact on this, and technicalities in some of the municipalities. Certain of the townships, etc., have not been proclaimed, and for that reason, you actually can't bill for the water. So there's those challenges, but I think the fundamental change that we need to drive is in the understanding of for instance, effluent and sewage as a resource as opposed to a cost issue. Because when we do that, then we start looking at that trillion rand and we start saying, but hold on, there's a large portion here that is bankable, that is, you know, so when you start, I always say, I look forward to the day that a sewage works becomes a concession as opposed to a cost. Because
can we get to that point? Is it,
absolutely. So, you know, when you start looking at a sewage works, firstly, you've got to understand what's in there. And some of you might know, but effectively, there's water, all right? And that's the most valuable resource. And Mike alluded earlier to the fact that we don't need one standard of water. We wash the pavement and we wash the cars and we drink the same water. And so that's the first problem we have, is we have this understanding of one standard. So there's water. Secondly, there's potential energy in there. So waste to energy technology then adds into the bankability of that. And then the third component that is obviously there's chemicals there that can be mined. So when you start looking at it like that, now you can attract the private sector, but of course we need an enabling environment that doesn't take away from the Constitution, that doesn't take away from government's right to the resource, because that is a nationalized resource, but that allows for private participation in this debate.
Theo, I think that's exactly where, you know, we started off. If we don't have the same basic understanding, and I think this audience for the last 10 minutes came quickly to that understanding as of how you thought about it and what it really is. Let's take another example. Let's take energy. You know, we thought about energy in ESCOM terms, and it's a huge issue. It's a problem, but there's huge opportunity in it. And it started developing, and they're only now grasping that opportunity. Water is exactly the same issue. And we have 60% of the water usage from agriculture. I can bet that a farmer does not understand water in this way. It's for him, it's a commodity he uses to produce. That's the main aim of certainly an irrigation farm. But when you start talking about a national asset and the water that's on the farm has to also accommodate this thinking, then you get somebody in another mindset. And as soon as you describe and get the farm, that's how I understand farmers. If they understand the principle, then they handle it in another and a very practical way. They are accommodative people who understand the bigger community, but we have to educate.
But there's also a market concept. If the value and price of water changes, behavior will change, and we see that with electricity.
I think farmers understand that from a production point of view. So they will take 1 millimeter of irrigated water and understand that the output can be, if I use it for a yearly, say for maize or for fruit production, they understand that there's different values of it. So that concept they understand.
Let's just unpack that. Is there measurement in terms of millimeter water output in this area? Do we measure that properly?
Very much so. Farmers, that's what they're good at. They understand they have to use this input and it will cause this output. That's their game.
You also noted Benoit solutions. Is it in line with what Fred's saying, or where's your thought process?
On two sides. So what Fred's saying is, I mean, we need to beneficiate water and its constituents. So
is part of that we perhaps didn't put enough value on water?
I think, you know, before the internet we did things very differently. Now that we have the internet, we're all connected, we can share information. Technology has caught up, technology has become a lot more affordable, and you've got a scarcity that's crept in, so it forces innovation. Only when there's a threat do we react. That's why let's not let a good crisis go to waste. And the water crisis is causing, for example, huge water reuse in Namibia since 1965 to 68. The first and only major town that reuses sewage, so we call it direct reuse. Right? So 25 to 30% of the water is treated sewage that's in there. The population has been...
That's now in
Windhoek. And they're used to this. But humans do not want to do this. we are forced to, in the next decade, we're going to see, so the EU's got a policy now, only since last year, for direct reuse, because the Mediterranean regions have got quite a water threat at the moment. So Spain is no better off than we are. On the unaccounted for water, I just wanted to say there are solutions. We don't have to replace everything overnight. So Cape Town, I've got the number, is something, their assets, their water sanitation assets are 60 billion. So the network is probably 30 to 40 billion rand. That's a year's budget, just about. So we don't have that money. But what they did start doing, and they did this under the previous dispensation, so this is apolitical, okay? They started with demand management through pressure regulation. So the pipe is big, it's under pressure, and it leaks. And when people don't use the water at night, the pressure builds up, it leaks a lot. So what they did is they put pressure reducing valves, PRVs you'll hear, and at night, from 11, 12 o'clock at night, they reduced the pressure, the leak stopped. So they saved up to 70 million litres a day during the drought. They're still saving that. So we can do that. There's a big initiative to do that in South Africa and our uni cities to reduce the pressure whilst we reinstate the bulk mains. Okay, we can't replace them overnight. So there's a solution through pressure. It's cheating to an extent, okay, but we have to hit these all running. We have to reduce our demand and we have to put new water in. The other thing is, as humans, we're all focusing on ground and surface water, including our farmers who are using most of our water, okay? That game has changed. It's shifted in South Africa and in a lot of other places, especially the Western Cape, but that's 3% of the water cycle. There's 97% out there. There's a sea, which is infinitely renewable. So we need to reuse what we've got inland, and we need to have and biomimic what mangrove swamps do and desalinate on the coast. And the first person who says it's too expensive is wrong. The internet was expensive also. Your PCs was expensive. We've all got them. It's become very cheap, very energy efficient. So there's a lot of solutions. So we've got lots of water available. It's how we harness it, how we apply technology, and how we contract with a nationalized resource. And that was Fred was alluding to, and that's not that easy to do, but we're busy developing mechanisms to do that.
Mike, from your point of view, and perhaps just a point that I also want to get towards is, what is the interaction and thought process? Because clearly a big player in this is government and central government. Because if it's a nationalized asset, if it's a right in the Constitution, then we need to understand how this matrix fits together.
I think it's certainly happening. I mean, what's happened in national terms, the reason that cities like Cape Town and the other big cities can do that is that over the last 5 years, we've created what's called the Urban Services Development Grant. And what that grant is, it gives to cities, and it doesn't say you must spend it on housing, must spend it on this and that. It says, here's a block of money, and then you can use it for these innovative solutions. And there are many of those going there. And there are many innovations, we've also got to say as South Africans, that the rest of the world learns from. I remember when I was city manager, Bill Gates used to come into Durban on a number of occasions because my head of water at that stage was also assisting and advising and looking at the issues around toilets and toilet technology. How do you move towards much more waterless or less water systems of sanitation? So technology, it's true, is playing a huge role there. Equally, we've got to, where the market comes in, we've got to be careful there because even the water for farmers is subsidized. You've got to be careful that you're not subsidizing things that we shouldn't be doing. So we've got to begin to, as a country as a whole, begin to say, how do we plan for where the future is going to be rather than only focusing on now? And that's difficult because there are communities we've seen in places like the Eastern Cape. There's been a depopulation in many of the rural areas where people have now moved simply because transport costs are so high to be closer to the national roads, etc. Driving here from Gauteng today, you can see that. The informal settlements right next to the N1, for example, because the reality is people, working class people, are spending half of their income on public transport and whatever shape
they're going to settle with.
So the result is that we've got to begin to plan for that now and with new systems. So now big cities, why is it we've been looking at the Alexandra issue, but equally over the road is the Sandton issue. You can't say we're only going to provide a water treatment plant serving Alex when you know you need to deal with one for Sandton. Now the difficulty is you actually need probably a new plant that'll serve both places, and that's the kind of talking that we have to do. Now, that's part of why the President spoke of that 400 billion infrastructure fund that he's working towards. We're working as part of a team that Zwelium Keys, who's the Minister of Cooperative Governance, set up to get together with the big financial institutions, the CISA and Banking Association of South Africa, to say, how do we get that 300 billion that we know that they have sitting that could be utilized for that in a way in which they will still get some returns on that money. I mean, and deal with a lot of these, what I regard as perception issues, people who don't have the faith they should have in our country in investing money that's available at the moment. How do we pull all of that together?
Perhaps the problem is not the problem, it's the attitude to the problem that's
Sure.
the problem. I want to turn this conversation to agriculture. You noted two things that for me, Benoit, was I wanted to clarify. The first thing is it's common assumed that 60% of the water is used by agriculture. On the one hand, then you made the point that 98% of all water is allocated. What does that mean?
So our traditional water reserve is rainfall, and we have a level of assurance which is about 9% of that roughly lands up in our rivers, of which 4% on its way percolates into the groundwater. Those dynamics are changing, but what we have at 30% of what lands up on the ground gives us a 98 or 99% level of assurity that water is available in our water resource system, be it surface or ground. So we're focusing on that. The game has changed. Okay, the rain patterns have changed. The seasons are changing. Right, evaporation's gone up. Now South Africa could go up not by 2, by 5 to 7 degrees. So the evaporation potential of our dams is 250% of our dam storage area. So if you look at this, doing the same thing day in, day out, expecting a different result, it's a sign of slight madness. So we have to change that. Now, from an agricultural perspective, this is an absolute train smash, because the traditional reserve is threatened, it's moving, and now we've got competition between agriculture and the rest of the users. And there's a rand per GDP for agriculture is about 11 rand. Okay? Now, and I'm also saying this, I can't remember these numbers, so I've got them written down, is our average GDP per litre of water used is 274 rand. Agriculture only brings in 11 rand.
So just, so for every rand
in the GDP, per cubic meter of water used, not litre, per cubic meter. So you're allocating production of the country per cubic meter of water. So the average is 274 rand. Agriculture is 11 rand. So agriculture is not bankable. We must starve. And that's why I'm saying there's a problem here. Whereas domestic supply is 2,100, mining is 900. So let's go and mine. Let's not grow crops. Let's import our crops and get forex through mining. So what I'm saying is now there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories. These are DTI categories. These categories are incorrect. Okay. What I'm suggesting is that we need to look at water in a different way. So maybe we need to add a weighting to water food, but also look at the food and not agriculture. So the water that's embedded, that goes through industry, because a lot of the manufacturing and the real value add is not on the farmland, it's in the urban area. So the municipalities are claiming that they're producing a better GDP than what the farmer is. The farmer has absolutely no weight to debate or to negotiate or to try and hold on to the 60% of water.
Simply because the output is not there according to those numbers.
So I'm saying we're measuring the numbers incorrectly, but we also need to re-establish what is food security.
Well, if you get that really wrong, we'll all be sitting here hungry, naked and sober.
Is it a problem?
The hunger.
No, the sobriety.
So going back to the original point, I think we're looking at things through the incorrect lenses. These things have been around, these indices have been around since the Second World War, one way or another. Okay, we need to change this, we need to look at it very differently. And I think we can do that, but our water laws don't speak to it. Our water master strategy doesn't speak to it. It says it doesn't speak to it. We have to look at that. So we have a lot of things that we have to change, and agriculture is the most at threat from our perspective, because you're the biggest user, the lowest economic value add, the way it's measured incorrectly, and climate change threat and population growth.
But agriculture is also an employer.
Yes.
And I think that national government, certainly President Ramaphosa, has recognized the importance of agriculture as an employer. And I think that that is the one thing. We get into technical recessions at the moment when agriculture is, in fact, having drought problems and the like. So I would think that the banks, certainly government, I think, recognizes that we've got to get that, the agricultural sector much more in sync with the needs of our country, which are around employment. It is the easiest to get employment going quickly.
It comes back to the agriculture. When people talk about agriculture GDP, they use primary agriculture at about 12% to 2.5%.
2.5%.
But if you go up, you can go to close to 13 to 15.
And that's multiplier effect.
And that's where people, that's... Fred?
Yeah, I think the important thing to, taking this debate a little bit further, you know, I think the importance of the food, energy, and water nexus is really where the debate comes. We understand the importance of food security. We understand the challenges that are facing us. And I think that anyone who denies that we have a major water crisis is an issue. But it also talks to how do we address these issues? How do we incentivize effective use of water? How do we get the sectors to talk to each other around the use of water? There's many economies globally that we can look at, examples, where collaboration, cooperation between various sectors and where planning actually goes in line with water use, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the one thing that we're not doing is we're not thinking, we're looking at what we have and we're saying, how do we manage what we have, as opposed to having an expansionary vision that says, this is where we're going, this is what we need to plan into, and we need to understand we face multiple challenges, but there are incredible opportunities. So one of the examples, for instance, is should we not be incentivizing a greater percentage of farmers to irrigate? And does government not play a role in that? Because that's also an investment from government's perspective into water security.
Can I just pick up on that? If you look at the California crisis, there was a punitive system. If you use more than this is the rate it goes up to. The Australians decided to go the other way. It incentivized. If you do water reticulation better, if you use then they incentivize it. And guess what? As soon as the drought was over, the California system went back to their usual usage, and the Australians stayed at their lower usage. So this is exactly what.
So it was once you, and I believe Cape Town is seeing some of that same elements of as the drought alleviates, people's behavior doesn't go back to where it was. They they adapt.
That's right.
I can see in my own home in terms of electricity, the change in terms of behavior of saving power is there. It is there. I'm going to take a few questions from the audience, and when I come back, I'm going to ask Mike a specific question, and so I give you time to think about it.
Good. What kind of wine I like?
When you walk out here, you'll see a message on your phone there that Mr. Ramaphosa phoned you and said, Mr. Sutcliffe, you have incredible experience in water. I wish to appoint you as the minister, but can you give me your priorities that you want to address immediately and how you're going to go about it?
It's to leave the country then.
Don't put on your phone.
Okay.
So that is what I'm going to ask you, and I'll take it from there as to building solutions around it. Any questions? There's a question there. Just state if there's any specific person you would like to answer the question, please. Who you are, and if there's any specific person you would like to address it to.
My name is Yolandi Skuman, and it's a question to the panel. And if we look at agriculture, there's quite a big pressure, especially South Africa, to transform more into sustainable agriculture. But what do you think is the outlook for implementing nature-based solutions in agriculture? And what would you say are the biggest barriers currently existing, especially from a farmer's perspective, in implementing such solutions?
Thank you very much. Can I take one or two other questions and then we take them from there? Any other questions at this point? Let's start with that question. Agriculture, nature-based, bigger transformation. Can I start with you, Francois?
So, a very simple example of what Yolandi is referring to is the use of natural flaylands. That is a natural base. And if we can imitate that, I think biology and nature has the answer. We just have to be switched on. We talk about the fourth industrial revolution. I think it's a biological revolution. The answers are there. We need to understand nature, and then we can solve. And with that specifically, farmers are extremely good because they react to nature and biology on a daily basis. If you have the ability to educate and let them understand the underlying principle, and you incentivize a farmer, they produce. Let's take the example of game. As soon as you incentivized farmers on swart springbokke, they immediately produced it. They could do it. So if you incentivize them in the right way, they can produce and execute. And I think this is what Yolandi is referring to.
Fred?
Yeah, just to add in, all water solutions ultimately are, nature has a way of solving its own problems. The problem that we have in urban and in high density areas is that we don't have time and we don't have space. And because of that, we have to design systems in. But the more rural you go and the more you have space and the more you have time, the more you can allow nature to take care of it. And if we all start polluting tomorrow, eventually the world will heal itself. And the same with water. But we need to, and I agree, there's a huge area of engagement with farmers in that area.
Mike?
I'd look at, I'll come back to the more difficult question in a minute, but, and I'm not really an agronomist or whatever, but the little I understand is that one of our problems is that we've allowed forests to emerge here, which in fact are not indigenous forests, but in fact are sucking too much water out the system. And I think that's something we can solve. I don't think they're contributing as much to the economy as much as they're contributing to negatively affect water supply. Secondly, I think that we must become much more local in what we do. It was funny, we introduced something when I was city manager that on spare pieces of land throughout the city, let's start planting food. So outside my office, I changed the rose bushes. I hate roses anyway, but there were rose bushes outside City Hall, and we started planting vegetables, lettuces and things like that. And it was interesting, the criticism from the public was, you can't do that because people will steal the vegetables. And I said, well, as long as they eat them, that's good. And what was very interesting about the ones outside my office was that there was a group of women who lived in public housing in some flats in the inner city. And they took control of these. And, I was talking to them one day. Every day they'd come and they'd water the vegetables. And then I said, and what are you doing? They say some of them had not been out their apartments for 10 years. And this gave them something to get there. It changes the life of inner city residents as well. So I think there are things that we can do, and I certainly agree. I think that we are not firm enough about doing things in the economy that we don't need to do. If you look at many of our energy challenges, arose because of agreements that we struck with companies that shouldn't be producing what they produce in this country at rates that, subsidized rates that we should. So
Some of the big
I do think
aluminium producers.
absolutely. So a lot of our problems, we sit and look at the immediate, and yes, corrupt people must go to jail, but we're also not looking at the structural features that impacted on that.
Can I just use the incentive example again? So a lot of Northern Cape farmers are incentivized to put up solar plants. They get paid to put up the plant and feed it into the national grid. Yolandi's question goes to, a farmer has a natural flayland. He clears the waterway. He doesn't get paid for it. In fact, he gets penalized for it because he can't use that land for any. He has to eradicate it and put in natural grazing and try and raise cattle there. If you change the mindset and pay him to sustain that, then they will use it.
Other countries in the world has that system specifically. River where you have river frontage and those kind of things. But that's a mind shift change.
Yeah.
The question about your
Get back to
SMS
that.
or your
So,
WhatsApp.
Well, certainly, hopefully that would never happen. Let's just put that on record. And I would not want it to happen because then I couldn't say what I want to say. I think that we've got to do two levels. The first is that big picture level, because unless we have a serious national plan that begins to say there's a pot of funds available over the next 10 to 20 years that we're not going to disturb, that comes from private sector, public sector, that we're going to invest in that future, the bulks particularly, but also the reticulation that we do need in that whole value chain, that we do need serious money to be put aside. Not $1 trillion, but it has to be serious money that allows us to really restructure what the overall system looks like. Otherwise, we just keep patching everywhere. The second is that we need very serious partnerships, primarily at a local level, with much more capacity locally to talk these issues through. You can't have a situation where water licenses are issued nationally, but local communities where the reticulation happens. If you start getting that conversation about who decides locally, if municipalities are involved in the water licensing process, they might be able to say, well, look, we're going to take away from this provider in order to give to agriculture, for example, whatever, because they'll serve that local interest. We've had far too much, and it's something we inherited, but the reality is we haven't got rid of it, where a Transnet sits nationally to decide which restaurant will have a restaurant in Durban Harbour. Anywhere else in the world, you have local ports authorities that work within the national guideline, but they work much more locally. So I think we've got to deal with both those levels. We've got to do the one which is big picture, and it's about national government saying we're going to rejig the water and sanitation infrastructure for our country in a way that is going to suit the kind of things we're talking about here. But locally, we're going to energize them, incentivize local communities for that. My complaint in Mfuleni, and there's a lot of work being done there, and a lot of good work, but also some problems, is we're not focusing enough on the businesses in those areas, focusing enough on the communities in those areas, and getting them to help find those solutions. So we say, oh, the solution might be just bringing in engineers. I keep saying, but you've got 600 members of staff in Mfuleni in water and sanitation. If you bring in people from the outside, what happens to these individuals that are already in the system? So you've got to manage it both ways, the big picture, but certainly make sure that we're revitalizing communities. And then you'll get the agricultural things sorted out. I've got no doubt.
Benoit, if you get that SMS?
Yeah, it's the first thing we need to do is, I'm going to use a big word, an independent water regulator. And why I say that is when we play rugby and we enjoy it, we use an independent referee. You can't be player and referee. And at the moment, we've got a nationalized resource. The custodian is national government, and the regulator is national government. And the regulator is not functional since 2013 or 14 because the basic dashboard of the blue, green, and no-drop report is not available. We can dig, but there's no use. The primary simple dashboard is not there, and the regulator has a budget of about 500-odd million a year. So from my perspective, the most important part is policy belongs in national government in consultation with all the stakeholders.
Where does the regulator fit in currently?
So the regulator fits in within the Department of Water and Sanitation, and Department of Water and Sanitation owns the water boards, the bulk water providers, for example. The catchment management agencies are not functional. Only 2 of the 9 are really functional. The idea, I think, is really good. And talking to what Mike is saying is one of the avenues is to have a national regulator that decentralizes to CMAs, to catchment management agencies, for example. So you've got local issues. Interbasin issues, maybe national level. But the quantity of our water and the quality of our water and the price of our water is not regulated independently. It is highly politicized, okay, by the producer of that. So the price I'm giving you as the water board, and I report to the Department of Water and Sanitation, is this is the price how I worked it, you take it, okay? We need to do that now. Best practice in the world is to have independent regulation, very decentralized. I think it's difficult to do as a big bang. It will take us some time, but we have a national electricity regulator. And I think we can improve on that in the water sector where we make the regulator completely separate from the Department of Water and Sanitation. So to me, there's no silver bullet. There's a few that we need, quite a few with a lot of money, but we need to have the regulatory side of things taken out of national government, out of provincial government, and put into the cash management agencies who are the best equipped, and to start putting back up the bad news, the good news, and best global practice. How do we calculate what water reserve we have? Because we don't really know what the actual reserve is. What do we have to allocate for the ecological reserve, which is for our long-term sustainability and tourism? What price, okay, for what sectors? Who do we subsidize? None of that is actually being done properly because the basics are not up there. And I'm not too worried why they're not up there. The regulator is not functional. And so we need an independent water regulator, and we're pushing very hard and lobbying very hard to have this put into the new landscape with the new Water Act, et cetera, because this is what we need to do. And we've done it for finances, we've done it for electricity, energy, gas, and the likes. Why aren't we doing it for water, which is our most critical resource? We need to depoliticize water.
Purely from a business perspective, you've made a few comments as to turning it into a business opportunity. If you listen to the inputs, what would make you excited from an investment business point of view?
Well, I think that like everything, the most important thing is certainty, policy certainty, and secondly, having a contracting authority. So one of the problems that we have within the water sector, unlike the renewables program, for instance, which was where the private producers could contract with Eskom, because of the complexity of the layers and municipals and many of the municipals not being bankable. Now, one of the problems that we have, just to go back a second, is where the need is greatest, which is in the rural areas. We spoke about day zero in Cape Town, but day zero happens every day around our country. Economies are constrained in Sheshego and in wherever the case may be. Businesses can't grow, businesses can't operate. It's not as visible as Cape Town. But so the more remote you become, you have two bigger problems. The municipalities are not bankable, and secondly, there's no technical ability to bring it to a bankable feasibility. So the chances of that being resolved are very small. So firstly, government should be focusing its attention where it's really needed and creating an environment where business can play next to government in the areas that are easily, like in the metros and in the major areas. But the key really is a contracting authority, because as a business, we have incredible technology available around South Africa. The problem is not a technology problem. We have huge funding. There's no shortage of funding. There's a skills base, although it's a challenge, but we can attract them, and we can train them. But what is missing is who do you contract with, and within which framework? And clearly, the existing framework is not working for that.
Do I get the idea from discussions, and I want to pull you here, Francois, you as chairman of AgBiz, which represents the businesses in the agriculture sector, which includes the banks, the big agriculture companies, the international suppliers. Your view on getting private-public partnerships going around water, not only agriculture per se, which we talked about in some of the previous days, but around water.
So let me just start with the practicality. In the rural areas, you have farmers, primary producers, and some of them with net balance sheets north of 100 million rand. So these are serious businessmen. They can execute. That's the capacity you have. You have input businesses who has serious balance sheets and have execution ability. If you incentivize them to look broader, let me use an example. A town very close to us, last year, the reticulation budget was 220 million rand. Almost nothing happened. People got paid salaries, and the current system were sort of just kept abreast. A private sector player came involved. He brought in a containerized water solution. It's state of the art, 14 million, and they solved the problem in that way. The municipality paid him to do the same which they couldn't execute with 220 million rand. This guy brought the solution. He's a local businessman capacity that we have there. That's the sort of thing. It's not that we doesn't have enough money. We must just allocate it. And there's enormous capacity in other role players already in the rural area who can execute that. As long as we keep saying this is your work and this is my work, then we sit with a system that doesn't function. And it affects both these parties.
No, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm not one who believes in public-private partnerships, because in the end, the public sector is there to make sure that the public good is satisfied, that people get access, etc. Private sector is there to make profit. And that's why where they can come in and assist in solutions, brilliant. But the problem with public-private partnerships, too much time is spent with two bodies that really are diametrically opposed.
So we should be clear on the roles of each body.
Absolutely.
And work on a...
And where there are solutions, because there's a lot of crooks too in the private sector.
Both sides.
But where they're able to come in and assist, absolutely bring them in.
Yeah, I fully agree with Mike saying about this whole concept of a public-private partnership. I think what you've got to understand is motive, and you've got to understand what drives each party. And when you align motives, that's when you get the maximum out of it. So when you can bring all of those around, and that's what this is about, is really debating and saying, how do we align all of our motives so that all of our oxen are at least going in the same direction? And that's the bottom line. And when that happens, then all of a sudden growth happens. You know, Japan is a classic example post-war, totally destroyed. But the politicians and business came together and they said, look, you know, we've got very, very different views, but it doesn't matter what is common to us. And let's not sit and argue about what we disagree on. Let's just have a look at what we have in common. And we enable it. Korea is another example. You know, so there's many of these that we can learn from.
Incidentally, the common vision, or the lack of a common vision, was a theme that came through in more than one conversation during this week. The fact that for somewhere in the last 10, 15 years, we lost that common vision and it got fragmented. Any other questions? I'm going to allow a last round of questions, yes, and then a few closing remarks. There's a question there, sir. Any other question? Anybody else? Anybody else?
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Fritz Otto. I'm from the Cape. I'm an agronomist, a little bit biological orientated. Okay, we were touching on a few things. I'm going to make basically a scenario. I'm going to sketch you a scenario, basically more like a proposal, and then I want to open it up to the panel for discussion. All right. We've been talking about structures, all right? So the first thing is we need to create a structure that can basically fit all the scenarios that's been put on the table and also help us solve some issues. All right, so one of the first thing is the public-private partnership is very important in terms of agriculture. I want to get us back to agriculture a little bit and get us back to some specifics there. Now, one of the things that we have to understand about soil health and the ability of soil to keep water, which will reduce irrigation water requirements, is carbon. Okay, now this is amazing sitting duck for guys. I've heard twice in the conversations, even more, that there are unlimited funds available. Okay, so there's a challenge. There's one of the things. Harvest organic material from the cities. We've been mentioned Japan, for instance. Okay, that's what they've been doing. Harvest organic materials from the cities. It can be done. We know it can be done. Just do a bit of research. Talk to me. And put that back into agricultural soil. All right. It's extremely nutritive, the organic material coming out of the kitchen. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is it will reduce irrigation water requirements. Okay, now linking in with that, if we look at the scenario where we need to push more clean water for human consumption, then it means that we have to look at the scenario we can harvest more of the grey water and put that back to agriculture, specifically closer in proximity to our rural or our urban areas for agriculture. It has been mentioned there's lots of land. It's true. Okay, so we can basically develop systems where we can enable people with water-wise irrigation systems that can basically give us two crop cycles in a one-year cycle to produce food. All right, so this is just, I think, a bit of brainstorming. I want to put it forth to you, but there's lots more detail around this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the comment. Any other question? Any other comment? Anybody would like to comment on that? Benoit?
Okay, one of the low-hanging fruit, especially inland, is indirect water reuse. So taking grey water and putting that to industrial, agricultural, commercial use. Just as a note, in Australia, they have a dual system. I can't remember, I think it's Victoria State. They're undoing it. Okay, so the dual system is not necessarily a silver bullet, I think, from an urban perspective, but it is, we know, from an industrial perspective, and definitely from an agricultural perspective. And we mustn't forget aeroponics, I think it's called, where the Americans, stack it in, so gate to plate, less kilometers and the likes. But sewage is a resource, so we've got the water, we don't need to purify it too much. We also have new biology that enables us to produce net energy, and we're also able to harvest the nutrients, so we have no sludge, and we're able to mobilize the metals, because you don't want the metals in the system unnecessarily. And those technologies, in actual fact, pay for themselves because of the off-takes. So now we don't have a sunken cost. So sewage is a low-hanging fruit, especially inland. On the coast, it has to be expedited because it's going into the sea. It's an absolute waste. Okay, we need to do that. But yes, we have to be talking together. We have to be working together. And from a private water sector perspective, we are organizing ourselves so that we speak with one voice, with everybody's agenda that they have, so that we're able to engage more effectively with government, so that we are aligned. And I'm pleased to say that there's a lot of alignment that's taken place through the Public-Private Growth Initiative in the last couple of months.
Benoit, can I take that as your closing comments?
Yes.
Mike?
I would certainly support that. Look, I think leadership is not something that should be just for government or just for the private sector or whatever. I think that's at times what we're lacking as a society, that people are not finding those solutions. And we're a hugely innovative country. When I look at the things that have been brought about in this country, we're punching way above levels internationally. And I really think that we've got to spend a lot more time in implementing solutions. So I'm not worried if there are 1,000 voices out there. Let those flowers bloom, but let them do it in a way in which there's much more conversation, much more communication, much more doing things that will actually benefit society. And water's a perfect opportunity for that.
Fred?
When Singapore faced their biggest water crisis, the leader of the country switched the water off for a day. And the next day, he held a press conference where he said, now you all understand the importance of water. And this is how we're going to manage it. So leadership, both on a political front, as well as us, we have a responsibility to form part of our future and to form part of that debate. And we need to articulate what we need within the context of all the other needs in the country and align those so that we can engage constructively with government once we as business and agriculture, whatever, have spoken to each other and understand how we cooperate through this whole process. So for me, it's really about engagement. We're in a new dawn. Someone last week said, this is not our second chance, this is our last chance. And I honestly believe that we have a chance to engage constructively and to grow this country, and now's the time to do that.
Thank you. Francois, last comment from you?
I'd like to just end on another note. What you saw today during this conversation was exactly why Nation in Conversation was put up. I think if you just think back to the start of the conversation, where you were, and you thought, well, what has this to do with me? And where we end now, it has to be informative, It has to set out the principles, and we have to end with solutions, and we have to get to the realization. Of course, they didn't talk about water in this last sentences. They talk about leadership. And that's really the responsibility to take on the challenges that we have. It's not somebody's problem, it's our problem. We have to solve it together. And this is really what this platform was about, to find that.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your
Thank you.
contributions. I think not only was it informative, I think it's a valuable discussion. It's discussions we need to have. And I think what I underlying to all of this, there is ways we can solve this. We need a bit of an attitude change. We need a bit more direction. We need a common vision. But we can do this as South Africa has proven in the past. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Nation in Conversation, in proud partnership with Senvis, Bayer, Engen, Nedbank, Afgri, Grain SA, and John Deere, in association with Hinterland and Isuzu.